Kansas Prairie, summer, 1885. While every homesteader rushed to build the lightest, quickest house before winter, Johann Classen was still digging. The Krimmer Mennonite immigrant carved a rectangular pit, 10 by 14 feet, then laid massive cottonwood poles across the top. His neighbors called it wasteful. They called him a fool. Instead of a proper shingle roof, he hauled 12 inches of living prairie sod onto those rafters, 7,000 pounds of earth and grass roots that neighbors swore would crush him in his sleep. They built light plank houses with thin roofs in 3 weeks. He spent 2 months on what they mocked as a sod coffin. Then January 1886 arrived. The great blizzard hit without warning, 30 below zero, 6-foot drifts, winds that stopped trains. Standard roofs leaked heat like sieves. Families burned cord after cord of wood and still froze. But that fool's buried house? It stayed 40 degrees warmer inside while using half the fuel. What did this immigrant understand about heat, roofs, and survival that everyone else missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Johann Classen had arrived in Marion County, Kansas, with 160 acres of prairie grass and a head full of knowledge that his new neighbors couldn't recognize. The 34-year-old Krimmer Mennonite had spent his youth in the Crimean steppe, where his family weathered winters that regularly dropped to 40 below in houses called Burdei, rectangular pits carved into the earth and topped with thick layers of sod. When other settlers looked at the Kansas horizon and saw empty land waiting for proper American houses, Johann saw familiar country that demanded the same solutions his people had used for generations. The standard wisdom among his English-speaking neighbors followed a predictable sequence. First year, dig a quick dugout just below grade to survive the initial winter. Second year, build up to a proper sod house with 18 to 30-inch thick walls made of prairie bricks, each block roughly 24 inches long, 12 inches wide, and 4 inches thick. Eventually, when cash and milled lumber became available, graduate to a frame house with shingle roof like civilized people back east. The goal was always upward, always toward something that looked like what they'd left behind. Johann ignored the fashion entirely. Through late summer and into September, while his neighbors rushed to complete their surface houses, he continued excavating his pit, 10 feet by 14 feet across the floor, matching the dimensions he'd grown up with in Ukrainian Burdei. The excavation went down 2.5 to 4 feet below ground level, deep enough that the soil walls would sit against earth that stayed close to the yearly average temperature, around 40 to 50 degrees in this part of Kansas, rather than swinging with every weather change above ground. He set 4 stout corner posts and a ridge beam about 6 feet above his finished floor, then leaned 6 to 8 inch diameter cottonwood and elm poles from the ridge beam down to the ground at both sides. The frame echoed the 4-post construction he'd seen in Pawnee Earth lodges during his journey west, though his rectangular design followed Eastern European patterns rather than the circular lodges of the Plains tribes. The poles would carry the weight that was coming next. Over the timber frame, Johann laid thin brush and prairie grass for a base layer. Then came a waterproof barrier improvised from what the frontier offered, strips of bark and canvas pieced together to shed moisture. Finally, the element that made his neighbors shake their heads, 12 inches of living prairie sod, roots still intact, hauled up in blocks and fitted together like a massive green quilt over his rafters. Using calculations any Norwegian or Swede would recognize from their own sod roof traditions, Johann's 14 by 10-foot roof carried roughly 7,000 pounds of earth and grass before a single snowflake fell. In a wet year or under heavy snow, that load could easily reach 10,000 pounds pressing down on his cottonwood poles. His neighbors, accustomed to lightweight shingle roofs that might weigh 500 pounds total, watched him work and calculated disaster. Elijah Turner, whose own 16 by 20-foot frame house boasted proper plank siding and a respectable cedar shingle roof, made his opinion known around the settlement. "You're burying yourself like a badger," he told anyone who would listen. "First wet snow, and that whole roof comes down on his family." Turner's wife, Sarah, refused to step inside Johann's dwelling, claiming she wouldn't have her children raised in a hole. The local preacher's wife went further, suggesting that living underground was unhealthy and unnatural for Christian families. The mockery followed predictable lines that echoed documented attitudes across frontier Kansas. Dugouts and earth-sheltered homes carried social stigma as temporary solutions that respectable families abandoned as quickly as possible. Johann's deliberate choice to build what looked like an improved dugout ran counter to every marker of progress his neighbors recognized. They called it a sod coffin and a prairie dog hole, terms that revealed their assumption that proper houses rose above ground rather than settling into it. Johann explained his logic once, quietly, then mostly let his neighbors think what they wanted. The earth walls, he pointed out, would sit against soil that hovered near the ground's steady temperature, moderating both winter cold and summer heat. The massive sod roof would do more than just provide insulation. Its weight would compress his log and sod walls together, eliminating the drafts that plagued lighter construction. Most importantly, the roof would transform the building's worst enemy into its greatest asset. In any frontier house, the roof typically hemorrhaged heat upward through thin materials and poor sealing. His roof would hold that heat like a blanket. Throughout the construction process, Johann kept detailed records in a small notebook, dates, outside temperatures, and careful counts of the firewood bundles he used each day. The measurements weren't random. They followed patterns his family had refined through decades of Crimean winters. He understood that his neighbors' light roofs and exposed walls worked adequately in moderate weather, but would fail when conditions exceeded normal ranges. His buried house, with its massive thermal mass, was designed not for average winters, but for the kind of winter that killed the unprepared. As autumn progressed and the first cold snaps arrived, temperature differences began to show. When outside air dropped to 10 degrees, neighbors' frame houses struggled to maintain 30 to 35 degrees inside, burning a full wagon load of wood every 24 hours. Johann's Burdei held steady at 45 to 48 degrees while consuming half that fuel. The small stove could go out at midnight, and by dawn the temperature had dropped only to freezing, still 20 degrees warmer than his neighbors achieved with fires burning all night. By December, as early storms began building over the Rockies, Johann's foolish house had quietly proven its daily advantages. But the real test was still coming, and his neighbors remained convinced that the first serious snowfall would vindicate their predictions of structural collapse. What none of them yet understood was that Johann had built not just for Kansas weather, but for the kind of winter that occurred once in a generation, the kind of winter that was already forming in the western mountains and moving their way. The autumn of 1885 brought unsettling signs that experienced plains dwellers recognized as warnings. Early November temperatures plunged 20 degrees below normal across Kansas, and newspaper reports from Dodge City to Kansas City noted unusual ice formations on the Arkansas River. Old-timers who remembered the harsh winter of 1871 began checking their fuel supplies and reinforcing livestock shelters. Weather patterns emerging from the Rocky Mountains suggested that the approaching winter might test every structure on the prairie. Johann's neighbors had completed their buildings by October, following construction patterns that worked reliably in typical years. Elijah Turner's frame house measured 16 by 20 feet, with single-wall plank construction, cedar shingle roof, and thin clay chinking between boards. The structure rose 8 feet to the eaves, presenting a large surface area to prairie winds, but offering the interior space an appearance that marked respectable frontier living. Sarah McBride had built a more traditional, soddy 14 by 18 feet with 2-foot-thick sod walls cut from buffalo grass prairie, but topped it with a light plank roof covered by just 3 inches of dirt, following the standard pattern that emphasized speed and material economy over thermal performance. The first serious cold snap arrived in early December, dropping overnight temperatures to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The performance differences that Johann had been quietly documenting in his notebook became stark and measurable. Turner's frame house, despite its large interior volume, struggled against the cold, as heat escaped through every plank seam and shingle gap. By dawn, with the stove burning steadily through the night, interior temperatures dropped to 35 degrees while consuming nearly a full wagon load of split cottonwood. roughly 1/4 cord of wood in 24 hours. McBride's sod-walled house performed better due to the thermal mass of her thick walls, maintaining 38 to 40 degrees by morning with similar fuel consumption. The sod bricks held heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, demonstrating why plains tribes and experienced settlers had long preferred earth construction. But her light roof remained the weak point in an otherwise sound design, radiating precious heat upward through thin planks and minimal dirt covering. Johann's buried house told a different story entirely. When the same 10-degree night struck, his interior temperature held steady at 48 degrees at dawn, even with the small barrel stove allowed to burn down to coals by midnight. His fuel consumption measured roughly half that of his neighbors, 6 to 8 split logs compared to their full wagon loads. The difference lay not just in superior insulation, but in basic physics. His earth-sheltered walls sat against soil that remained near 45 degrees year-round, while his neighbors' walls fought air temperatures that swung from summer highs to winter lows. As December progressed, each cold spell reinforced the pattern. Johann's notebook filled with data that would have fascinated later building scientists. Outside temperatures, interior readings taken morning and evening, precise fuel counts, and observations about heat distribution within his small space. The thick sod roof, rather than collapsing under its own weight as neighbors predicted, settled into a dense, nearly monolithic cap that eliminated air infiltration and created what modern engineers would recognize as exceptional thermal mass. By late December, weather reports from railroad stations across Kansas began carrying ominous language. Temperatures in the Colorado mountains had established persistent patterns 30 degrees below normal. Storm systems building over the Continental Divide showed unusual intensity and southern reach. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway issued warnings about potential service disruptions, and territorial newspapers began reprinting survival advice from the Dakotas, where similar conditions had proven deadly. January 2nd, 1886 brought the leading edge of what would become known as the Great Blizzard of 1886. Wind speeds reached 30 to 40 miles per hour by midday, driving crystalline snow horizontally across the prairie. Within 6 hours, drifts began forming against every vertical surface, fence posts, barn walls, and the exposed sides of frame houses. Temperature readings, where they could be taken safely, showed a steady drop toward 20 below zero with no sign of moderation. Johann's massive sod roof, which neighbors had spent months predicting would collapse, simply absorbed the mounting snow load without visible deflection. The short span between his walls, only 14 feet at the widest point, distributed even extreme loads well within the capacity of his oversized cottonwood rafters. More importantly, the additional snow provided extra insulation, creating a layered system of earth, grass roots, and wind-packed snow that approached 18 inches of total thickness above his living space. Turner's cedar shingle roof began showing stress by the second day of the storm. Individual shingles cracked and lifted under alternating wind pressure and snow load, allowing moisture to penetrate and refreeze in expanding cycles that loosened the entire roof system. McBride's thin plank roof, covered by minimal dirt, started sagging visibly at the center where wet snow had accumulated to depths exceeding 2 feet. The mockery that had followed Johann's construction through the autumn began shifting towards something approaching fear. Neighbors who had joked about his sod coffin now traded worried speculation about what would happen if that massive roof ever did give way. But Johann, checking his central posts and rafters by lantern light each evening, found no signs of stress in his carefully chosen timber. The cottonwood poles, cut to diameters that seemed excessive for such a small building, carried their concentrated load with substantial safety margins built into every joint and connection. By the fourth day of the storm, with outside temperatures holding steady at 25 below zero and winds showing no signs of abating, the theoretical advantages of Johann's design had become stark, measurable reality. His neighbors' houses were losing the battle against a winter that exceeded every assumption built into their construction. Meanwhile, the buried house that everyone had expected to collapse sat quietly under its heavy blanket of sod and snow, its interior remaining warm enough that water never froze in the wash basin. The night of January 7th marked the storm's peak intensity, when conditions reached levels that would be remembered across Kansas for generations. Outside air temperatures plunged to 28 degrees below zero, driven by winds that sustained 35 to 40 miles per hour with gusts approaching 60. Snowdrifts climbed past window height against every exposed structure, while the combination of wind and cold created conditions that could kill an unprotected person within minutes. In frontier construction of the 1880s, understanding heat loss meant understanding a simple but brutal reality. In poorly insulated houses, nearly 40% of precious stove heat escaped straight upward through inadequate roofs. Modern building science would later quantify this phenomenon precisely, but Johann's neighbors were learning it through direct, life-threatening experience. Every split log fed into their stoves faced the same losing battle, trying to heat interior air faster than that air could escape through thin roof materials into the frozen night above. Turner's frame house demonstrated this principle with merciless clarity. Despite burning his stove red hot and consuming nearly 3/4 of a cord of wood over 72 hours, his interior temperature barely reached 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost formed along every plank seam where cold air infiltrated, and desperate attempts to stuff cloth into gaps provided only marginal improvement. The cedar shingle roof, elevated 8 feet above the floor and covered by minimal materials, created a perfect conduit for heat loss. Warm air rose naturally toward the ceiling, then radiated through thin shingles into air that was 50 degrees colder, creating a continuous cycle that no amount of fuel could overcome. Sarah McBride's sod house told a more complex story. Her 18-inch thick sod walls performed exactly as intended, holding and slowly releasing heat even as outside temperatures reached their lowest points. A person standing against the interior wall could feel genuine warmth radiating from the compressed prairie sod, proof that massive thermal mass could store and moderate temperature swings. But her roof remained the fatal flaw in an otherwise sound design. The light plank construction, covered by just 3 inches of dirt, provided minimal resistance to upward heat flow, creating the same thermal hemorrhaging that plagued Turner's frame house. The physics played out in measurable ways. McBride's house maintained 30 to 32 degrees inside with constant firing, burning nearly as much wood as Turner despite superior wall performance. Ice formed along the roof's interior surface, where escaping heat met cold air, then melted and refroze in cycles that saturated the thin dirt covering and created increasing risks of structural failure and interior leakage. Johann's Burdei revealed what happened when the fundamental heat loss equation changed. Inside his earth-sheltered space, a thermometer hanging on the wall registered 42 degrees near the floor and 48 degrees at head height, temperatures that allowed normal activities without the multiple layers of clothing his neighbors required indoors. The small barrel stove burning perhaps 1/3. The fuel of neighboring houses maintained these comfortable conditions because the heat it generated stayed where it belonged. The technical explanation lay in two complementary systems working together. The earth-sheltered walls sat against soil that remained near 45 degrees year-round, creating a thermal buffer that moderated temperature swings rather than fighting them. Unlike exposed walls that battled air temperatures ranging from summer highs to winter lows, Johann's walls worked with the Earth's stable temperature, requiring far less energy to maintain interior comfort. More dramatically, his massive sod roof had transformed the building's greatest weakness into its primary strength. The 12 inches of living prairie sod, compressed under its own weight and topped by additional snow, created an insulation system that modern engineers would recognize as exceptionally effective. The dense root mat eliminated air movement through the roof structure, while the sheer mass of soil slowed heat transfer through thermal lag. Quick external temperature changes took hours to influence interior conditions. The compression effect provided an additional benefit that Norwegian and Swedish builders had understood for centuries. The 7,000 pounds of sod pressing down on Johann's log walls squeezed every joint tighter, eliminating the drafts that plagued lighter construction. Wind that whistled through gaps in frame houses, and even thick-walled soddies met no openings in Johann's compressed structure. Over the storm's worst 72-hour period, fuel consumption told the story in stark numbers. Turner's frame house devoured nearly a full cord of seasoned cottonwood, while failing to prevent frostbite among his family members. McBride's soddy consumed similar amounts of fuel with slightly better results, but her children still suffered from cold-related injuries despite her constant fire-tending efforts. Johann's household burned perhaps half a cord during the same period while maintaining interior conditions warm enough for normal sleeping and daily activities. His small notebook recorded the exact measurements: outside temperatures ranging from -15 to -30 degrees, interior readings that never dropped below 40 degrees, and fuel consumption that averaged 6 split logs per 24-hour period compared to his neighbor's consumption of 15 to 20 logs. The difference represented more than comfort. It meant the margin between survival and catastrophe. When the storm finally broke after 6 days, Turner's family had exhausted their wood supply and faced the choice between burning furniture or risking hypothermia. McBride's fuel lasted longer due to her sod walls, but her roof had begun failing structurally, with water damage spreading through her interior from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Johann's house emerged from the blizzard with interior conditions barely changed from normal winter operation. His fuel supply remained adequate for another full week of similar weather, and his structure showed no signs of stress or damage. The massive roof that neighbors had predicted would collapse sat unchanged under its burden of compacted snow, having proven that understanding the relationship between thermal mass, earth coupling, and heat retention could mean the difference between comfort and catastrophe when prairie weather exceeded every normal assumption. The morning of January 13th brought a silence that felt more ominous than the howling winds of the previous week. As the blizzard finally exhausted itself, settlers across Marion County emerged to survey damage that would reshape their understanding of frontier construction. The storm had tested every structural assumption built into their houses, and the results carried implications that extended far beyond individual comfort or fuel consumption. Sarah McBride's sod house presented the most dramatic failure. The light plank roof, saturated by repeated cycles of interior ice melting and refreezing, had sagged 6 inches at the center beam. Water stains spread across her interior walls where moisture had penetrated the compromised roof system, and the smell of wet earth and rotting wood filled her main room. More critically, the structural integrity of her ceiling remained questionable. Every additional snow load threatened complete collapse of the water-weakened planks. 2 miles east, the Hendricks family discovered that their barn roof had failed entirely during the storm's peak, crushing 3 milk cows and destroying most of their stored hay. The structure had followed conventional light frame construction with a standard gable roof, adequate for normal snow loads, but helpless against the combination of wet snow and sustained winds that had characterized this particular blizzard. Similar failures dotted the county, marking houses and outbuildings where builders had calculated for average conditions rather than extreme events. Turner's frame house remained standing but barely habitable. Frost covered the interior walls in thick layers that refused to melt, even with the stove burning continuously. His family had resorted to sleeping in a single room with heated stones wrapped in blankets, burning furniture when their split wood supply ran low on the 4th day of the storm. His wife, Margaret, had developed severe chilblains on both hands from the constant cold, and their youngest child showed signs of respiratory distress that would persist for weeks. By January 14th, desperation overcame pride. Turner appeared at Johann's door shortly after dawn, his breath visible in the frigid air as he made a request that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. His house remained too cold for human habitation, his fuel supply was exhausted, and his family needed immediate shelter. Could they possibly stay in the dugout until conditions improved? Sarah McBride arrived 2 hours later with her 3 children and elderly mother, making the same request with obvious reluctance. Her compromised roof made her house dangerous as well as cold, and she had nowhere else to turn. By noon, 12 people had gathered outside Johann's earth-sheltered home, seeking admission to the structure they had universally mocked as a sod coffin and prairie dog hole. Johann accepted them all, but established strict protocols that reflected his understanding of how small, earth-sheltered spaces functioned under crowding. The interior measured approximately 140 square feet with 6.5 feet of headroom at the center, requiring careful management to accommodate 12 people without compromising the thermal performance that made survival possible. He organized sleeping areas using hanging blankets to create alcoves around the perimeter, established a rotation schedule for fire tending duties, and implemented controlled access to the single entrance to minimize heat loss. The tunnel entrance, borrowed from Pawnee Earth Lodge design, proved crucial for managing the increased traffic. Johann had excavated a short, low passage that trapped dense cold air in its bottom section, preventing the frigid outside atmosphere from flowing directly into the main living space when people entered or exited. This design feature, which neighbors had initially seen as unnecessarily elaborate, now proved essential for maintaining interior temperatures with frequent door openings. Ventilation presented the most delicate challenge. His smoke hole, sized for a family of 4, now served triple that population in a space where carbon dioxide buildup could prove fatal. Johann managed the balance carefully, opening the vent wider during peak occupancy periods despite the heat loss, then closing it partially during sleeping hours when metabolic activity decreased. His neighbors watched him adjust the opening with cloth and wooden covers, finally understanding that successful earth-sheltered living required active management rather than passive endurance. The attitude shift happened gradually, then all at once. Margaret Turner, who had refused to enter the dugout during construction, found herself sleeping comfortably for the first time in a week. Her frostbitten hands began healing in the consistently warm, humid air that characterized Johann's interior environment. Sarah McBride's mother, who had loudly proclaimed that Christian families don't live in holes, admitted after 3 days that she felt warmer and slept better than she had in her own house even before the storm. Children provided the most honest testimony. Turner's youngest son, who had been lethargic and pale from cold exposure, regained his energy and appetite within 48 hours of moving into the earth-sheltered space. McBride's daughter started playing normally again, no longer huddling constantly near heating sources as she had in their failed sod house. The contrast was unmistakable and impossible to dismiss. Johann's notebook, filled with measurements taken throughout the crisis, provided quantitative proof of what everyone could feel. Over the 5-day period when his house sheltered 12 people, interior temperatures averaged 43 degrees, while outside conditions ranged from 10 below to 25 below zero. His fuel consumption, despite heating and cooking for 3 times his normal occupancy, remained 60% below what Turner's family had burned trying unsuccessfully to heat their frame house for 4 people. The data told a story that transcended individual preference or cultural prejudice. Johann's earth-sheltered house, with its massive sod roof, had outperformed conventional construction so dramatically that denial became impossible. Turner, examining the neat columns of numbers by lamplight, finally understood that his neighbor's primitive methods represented sophisticated building science rather than backward stubbornness. By the time the storm's aftermath allowed families to return to their own houses, a fundamental shift had occurred in local attitudes toward earth-sheltered construction. The man they had called a fool had become the person whose judgment they trusted most when conditions exceeded normal expectations. When word spread through Marion County that the families in Johann Klassen's earth-sheltered house had weathered the blizzard of 1886 without deaths, structural failures, or serious cold injuries, the story carried implications that extended far beyond one homestead's survival. Railroad telegraph operators resuming service after a week of storm-imposed silence transmitted reports eastward describing unprecedented snow depths, livestock losses in the thousands, and scattered accounts of frontier construction that had either failed catastrophically or performed beyond all expectations. Johann's reputation underwent a transformation that reflected broader shifts in how settlers understood their relationship with plains weather. The phrase, "that crazy sod roof," disappeared from local conversation, replaced by "that warm house," and inquiries about construction details that neighbors had previously dismissed as wasteful eccentricity. Turner, whose family had survived the storm only through Johann's hospitality, began asking specific questions about sod thickness, rafter spacing, and the precise depth needed for effective earth sheltering. The spring building season of 1886 brought practical changes that validated Johann's methods through imitation. Turner, rebuilding sections of his damaged frame house, added 3 feet of packed sod and prairie dirt on top of his existing shingle roof. He reinforced his rafters with additional cottonwood beams and created a low sod berm against his north wall, essentially borrowing elements from earth-sheltered design to improve his conventional structure's thermal performance. Sarah McBride made more dramatic modifications. Rather than repair her failed light roof, she deepened her dugout cellar and extended it into a proper Burdei design, creating a 10 by 12-foot earth-sheltered room with a tunnel entrance and heavy sod cap. Her original sod house remained above ground for storage and appearances, but her family's actual living space had moved underground, following the pattern that Johann had demonstrated could outperform surface construction during extreme weather. The Hendricks family, after losing their barn roof and livestock during the storm, rebuilt using a hybrid approach that combined conventional framing with massive earth covering. Their new structure featured 12-inch thick sod walls below grade and an earth-covered roof supported by timber substantial enough to carry the kind of loads that Johann's house had handled without stress. The design represented a direct acknowledgement that average weather construction standards were inadequate for Plains realities. Local adoption patterns reflected a broader historical precedent that settlers were only beginning to recognize. The Pawnee and Mandan tribes had been building earth lodges across the Great Plains for centuries, using heavy timber frames covered with thick layers of branches, grass, and sod to create structures that remained comfortable year-round despite temperature swings that could range from 40 below zero to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. These circular lodges, some measuring 40 feet in diameter, had demonstrated the same principles of thermal mass and earth coupling that Johann had applied to his rectangular Ukrainian design. The connection to Scandinavian building traditions became equally clear as more settlers recognized the similarities between Johann's sod roof and the turf-covered log houses that had sustained Norwegian and Swedish families through centuries of harsh winters. Norwegian immigrants in Minnesota and the Dakotas had been building sod roofs since the 1850s, understanding that the weight of living turf not only provided insulation, but tightened log construction by compressing joints and eliminating drafts. Word of successful earth-sheltered construction spread beyond Marion County through railroad networks and territorial newspapers that documented unusual building methods alongside reports of storm damage and reconstruction efforts. The Kansas City Star published a brief account of underground houses that had outperformed conventional construction during the Great Blizzard, while territorial agricultural reports began mentioning earth-sheltered designs as practical alternatives for settlers willing to prioritize thermal performance over conventional appearance. Johann's detailed notebook, filled with temperature readings and fuel consumption data collected throughout the crisis, provided documentation that would have impressed later building scientists. His measurements showed that earth-sheltered construction with massive thermal mass could maintain interior temperatures 15 to 20 degrees warmer than conventional houses, while consuming 40 to 60% less fuel. Performance differences that meant survival rather than catastrophe when conditions exceeded design assumptions. The technical principles underlying these results would eventually be validated by modern building science, which confirmed that earth-sheltered walls and roofs significantly reduce temperature swings by damping and delaying heat flow through thermal mass effects. Properly designed sod roofs achieve respectable insulation values through thickness and density, especially compared to the uninsulated plank or shingle roofs common on the frontier. Most importantly, earth coupling allows buildings to work with ground temperatures rather than fighting air temperatures, reducing the energy required to maintain comfortable interior conditions. Contemporary green building movements would later rediscover many of the same principles, using sod roofs and earth-sheltered design to reduce heating and cooling loads in residential construction. Modern earth-sheltered houses, built with engineered materials and mechanical systems that Johann could never have imagined, still rely on the fundamental physics of thermal mass and ground coupling that made his Burdei successful during the blizzard of 1886. By the autumn of 1886, Johann's influence had spread through 3 counties as families prepared for the possibility of another severe winter. His willingness to share construction details and measurements had created a small network of earth-sheltered and earth-enhanced houses that represented a quiet revolution in frontier building practices. The mockery had stopped entirely, replaced by respectful requests for advice from settlers who now understood that survival in extreme conditions required methods tested by generations of experience rather than assumptions imported from milder climates. The lesson embedded itself in local memory. On the prairie, the wind and weather care nothing for architectural fashion or social expectations, only for the physics of heat transfer and structural adequacy. Johann's success had demonstrated that the most practical solution often comes from understanding older wisdom rather than rejecting it, and that sometimes the difference between comfort and catastrophe lies in building not for average conditions, but for the worst nature can deliver.